The battlefield smelled like iron and ash. Not the clean scent of forged weapons in a smithy, but the thick, choking smell of blood spilled faster than the earth could drink it. Kalen moved through it with hands that no longer trembled. They had trembled once, years ago when he'd first seen a man's insides where his insides weren't meant to be, but not anymore. Now his hands were steady, quick, deliberate. A medic survived by separating noise from need. Screams became background. Orders became wind. The only thing that mattered was breath, who still had it, and who didn't. Around him, humans and orcs tore at each other in the last violent surge of a battle neither side truly understood anymore. Shields splintered. Axes rang against steel. The sky above churned gray as if even the heavens had grown tired of watching. Kalen knelt beside a fallen human soldier, pressed cloth into a chest wound, counted heartbeats, and knew within seconds the boy wouldn't see another sunrise. He closed the soldier's eyes gently before standing again. He didn't allow himself time to mourn. There would be time later. There was always later, until there wasn't. A horn blasted from the eastern ridge. Orc reinforcements were pushing through the broken flank. Kalen glanced up just long enough to see a towering figure at the center of the advance, armor blackened with soot, crimson war cloak snapping behind her like a banner of defiance. Even from a distance, her presence altered the battlefield. Orc warriors rallied around her movements with precise coordination, not chaos. This wasn't brute savagery. This was strategy, controlled violence. Someone important. Then the arrow came. It flew from somewhere unseen, perhaps a panicked human archer retreating toward the tree line. The shaft cut through smoke and struck the towering orc square in the side where armor plates met. She staggered. A second arrow followed, piercing just beneath her shoulder. The Iron Legion faltered for half a breath, just long enough for the battle line to collapse into confusion. Orcs roared, some charging forward, others dragging the wounded away. But the towering figure fell to one knee, then to the blood-soaked ground. Kalen didn't think. He ran. It was a foolish decision. A medic crossing between active lines was a gamble with death, and this was no human soldier he rushed toward. As he approached, he saw her clearly for the first time. Green skin streaked dark with blood, jaw set even in unconsciousness, silver braids tangled in her helmet's crest. Her armor bore the insignia of command. Twin axes crossed beneath a crescent fawn. Recognition flickered in the back of his mind. He had seen that crest sketched in war briefings. General Vera Bloodtide, the butcher of Eastfall. He had treated men who whispered her name like a curse, and she was bleeding out in front of him. An orc warrior lunged toward Kalen, axe raised, but another horn sounded from deeper within the orc ranks. A retreat call. Their forces were pulling back. The wounded were being abandoned in the chaos, including her. Kalen dropped to his knees beside Vera and pressed his hands against the arrow wound. Blood pulsed warm against his palms. He should have left her. Any soldier would have. Saving her meant returning the enemy's sharpest blade to the war. But when he looked down at her face, stripped of command and fury, she did not look like a monster. She looked like someone's daughter, someone's leader, someone who had bled red into the same dirt as his own people. Her eyes fluttered open, amber, sharp even through pain. She saw the human insignia on his shoulder and tried to move, but her body betrayed her. A low growl escaped her throat. "Don't," Kalen said quietly, already breaking the shaft of the first arrow. "You move, you die." Her gaze burned with hatred, or perhaps confusion. It was hard to tell. "Why?" she rasped in accented common tongue. Kalen didn't answer immediately. He worked. Hands steady, pressure firm, cloth packed into wounds, blood slowing, breath stabilizing. Around them, the battle retreated like a tide pulling back from shore. Finally, he met her eyes again. "Because you're alive," he said simply. And in that moment, as smoke drifted between them and the cries of war faded into distance, something shifted, not in the battlefield, but in the story that had been written long before either of them picked up a weapon. He lifted the unconscious Orc General onto his shoulders and carried the enemy to safety. When General Vera Bloodtide opened her eyes again, the first thing she noticed was the smell. Not the acrid smoke of burning siege towers or the metallic rot of a battlefield left too long in the sun. This was cleaner, linen, boiled herbs, antiseptic oils. A healer's tent. Human. Her instincts surged before her thoughts did. She tried to sit up, but pain flared white-hot along her side and shoulder, forcing a sharp breath through her teeth. Leather restraints bound her wrist loosely to the cot, not cruelly tight, but firm enough to remind her of where she was. Captured. She turned her head slowly. Canvas walls. A wooden table stacked with bandages. A basin of reddened water. And seated beside her, grinding dried leaves into powder with measured patience, was the human who had stood over her on the battlefield. He looked different without smoke and chaos around him. Younger than she'd expected. His armor removed. Healer's apron stained dark at the hem. Calm. Too calm. You should still be dead, she muttered, voice hoarse. The man didn't look up immediately. So should half the men I treated today, he replied evenly. Death's been busy. She studied him carefully, amber eyes sharp despite the weakness in her limbs. Why am I breathing? The grinding stopped. He finally met her gaze. Because I decided you would. No mockery. No hatred. Just fact. Vera felt anger coil in her chest. Orc commanders did not survive by enemy mercy. Mercy was a tool humans used when they wanted leverage or humiliation. You think sparing me makes you noble? She asked. It makes you foolish. Maybe, he admitted. He stood, carrying the powdered herbs to her bedside. But you were bleeding out. And I don't leave the bleeding to die if I can stop it. She let out a harsh breath that might have been a laugh if it weren't edged with pain. You realize who I am. It wasn't a question. Yes, he said. General Vera Bloodtide. Iron Legion. A flicker passed through her eyes. No fear there. Only acknowledgement. Then you know returning me to my army means more of your soldiers die. His jaw tightened slightly. Probably. He began unwrapping the cloth at her side to check the wound. She did not flinch. She would not give him that satisfaction, but she watched every movement like a hawk tracking prey. And yet, she pressed, you saved me. I'm a medic, he said quietly, not a strategist. Outside the tent, she could hear distant human voices, guards shifting positions, boots against dirt. She was not naive. She knew this was temporary. A high-ranking captive would be worth negotiations, ransom, advantage. But something in the man's tone unsettled her. He hadn't spoken like someone seeking glory or advantage. He had spoken like someone explaining the weather. The bandage came away. He examined the stitches, crude battlefield work, but effective. You'll live, he said after a moment. If infection doesn't set in. If, she repeated dryly. I'm not a miracle worker. He replaced the dressing carefully, hands steady and clinical. No unnecessary touch. No cruelty. No reverence either. Just work. She studied him in silence. Most humans she'd encountered either hated her on sight or trembled in her presence. This one did neither. What is your name, healer? She asked at last. A pause. Then, Kalen. No rank. No title. Just a name. Kalen. She repeated slowly, tasting it as if it were foreign metal. When I am returned to my people, they will not thank you. I'm not looking for thanks. Then what are you looking for? She asked, genuinely curious now. He finished tying the bandage and stepped back. For a moment, his composure cracked, not with anger, but exhaustion. An end, he said. Outside, a trumpet call echoed faintly from the hills, the signal for ceasefire negotiations. Vera recognized it immediately. Not retreat, not advance. Parley. She looked at Kalen again, seeing him now not just as the man who saved her life, but as a variable, a complication in a war already stretched thin. You may have just altered more than a battlefield, she murmured. Kalen gave a tired half-smile. Wouldn't be the first time I made a mistake. But as the tent flaps stirred in the wind and the sound of diplomats gathering replaced the clash of steel, neither of them knew that the choice made in smoke and blood would soon bind them in ways neither sword nor treaty had ever demanded before. The ceasefire did not arrive like peace. It arrived like exhaustion wearing a white flag. By dusk, both armies had withdrawn to opposite ridgelines overlooking the scarred valley, where too many bodies lay waiting to be counted. Fires burned low. The usual victory chants were absent. There was no triumph in the air, only the heavy stillness of forces that had realized, at last, that winning had begun to look exactly like losing. Inside the command pavilion of the human encampment, generals leaned over maps stained with candle wax and frustration. Reports were delivered in tight voices. Casualties, severe. Supplies, dwindling. Morale, unstable. And at the center of it all, One fact hung like a blade suspended by thread. General Vera Bloodtide was alive. The news had spread faster than the smoke cleared. The Butcher of Eastfall survived. Not recovered by her legion. Not rescued in retreat. Saved by a human medic. Some officers called it strategic opportunity. Others called it madness. A few called it treason in softer voices that never reached the front of the tent. Across the valley, in the Orc War camp, the reaction was no less volatile. Vera's absence had shaken the Iron Legion. She was not merely a commander. She was cohesion given form. Without her, rival captains jostled for authority. Whispers moved through ranks like sparks through dry grass. Had she been captured? Slain? Betrayed? When word came through an intercepted scout that she lived, fury erupted alongside relief. Orc warriors did not trust survival without dominance. If she breathed under human canvas, there would be a cost. Inside the human medical tent, Vera felt the tension long before anyone told her. Guards had doubled. Conversations hushed when she stirred. Kalen still tended her wounds with the same steady quiet, but there was something new behind his eyes now. Not regret, but awareness. The ripple had begun. "You hear it, don't you?" she asked him that evening, as distant horns signaled the beginning of diplomatic assembly. "Hear what?" he replied, cleaning dried blood from her shoulder stitches. The shift, her gaze fixed on the tent ceiling. Armies do not pause for long. When they do, it is because something larger is moving beneath them. He did not argue. Outside, human envoys were already riding under banner of truce toward the neutral ground between camps. Orc representatives advanced from the opposite ridge, their silhouettes unmistakable against the dying light. The war had reached a stalemate months ago, though no one had wanted to name it. Human supply lines stretched thin. Orc territory remained unbroken but isolated. Each victory cost more than it gained. Entire generations of young soldiers, on both sides, had been reduced to markers on parchment. The treasury groaned. The clans fractured. And now, with Vera alive because of human mercy, an opportunity had emerged that neither king nor war chief could ignore. In the human command pavilion, a silver-haired diplomat leaned forward over the negotiation table. "Your general lives," he said evenly to the Orc emissary across from him. "Saved by one of ours." The Orc emissary's tusks flashed faintly in torchlight. "We are aware. Her life can be returned," the diplomat continued, "as proof that we do not seek annihilation." A low rumble vibrated from the emissary's chest. "And in exchange?" "Peace," the diplomat answered. "Not a season of truce. A treaty." The word hung dangerous and fragile between them. Back in the tent, Vera closed her eyes as if she could already see the shape of what was forming. "They will use me," she said softly. Kalen paused. "You're valuable. I am leverage." He could not deny it. He had never intended to change the war. He had intended only to stop bleeding. But wars did not respect small intentions. They consumed them, reshaped them, weaponized them. Outside, the torches burned late into the night. Voices rose, fell, clashed, not with steel, but with words. Proposals were made. Concessions debated. Pride swallowed and reswallowed. The truth lay plain before them all. Neither side could continue without breaking completely. And in that realization, a radical thought began to take form. Not ransom, not prisoner exchange. Something symbolic. Something impossible enough to shock both nations into stillness. Vera opened her eyes again and looked at Kalen. Really looked at him. Not as enemy, not as captor, but as the man whose hands had kept her alive. "You have no idea," she murmured, "what you have done." Kalen met her gaze steadily. "I saved a life." "No," she said quietly. "You lit a fuse." And beyond the canvas walls, beneath banners stiff in the cold night wind, the first whispers of a treaty began to circulate. One that would demand more than surrender of arms. One that would demand something far stranger. Something neither of them would be ready to hear when dawn came. Dawn did not break gently over the valley. It rose cold and pale, casting long shadows across ground that had not yet been cleared of the dead. Between the two armies, a neutral pavilion had been erected overnight. White canvas, unmarked by either banner. Inside, a long wooden table divided human diplomats from Orc emissaries. Guards lined the perimeter, hands resting on hilts not in threat, but in habit. Peace, when it came near, always felt like a trap waiting to spring. Vera was escorted under heavy watch from the medical tent to the pavilion's edge. Her steps were steady now, though pain still tugged at her side. She wore no shackles, an intentional gesture. On the opposite side of the field, Iron Legion warriors stood rigid, eyes burning with restrained fury and fierce relief at the sight of their general alive. Kalen had not expected to be summoned. He stood awkwardly behind the human delegation, healer's coat replaced by a clean officer's tunic he hadn't worn in years. He did not belong in rooms where treaties were written. He belonged where blood was spilled, not where history shifted. Yet when the chief human diplomat called his name, he stepped forward anyway. Vera saw him immediately. Her gaze sharpened, suspicion threading through her composure. The diplomat cleared his throat. "We have reached the final point of negotiation." Silence settled like snowfall. Both sides acknowledge the war has reached impasse. Further bloodshed will weaken us beyond repair. The Steel Council and the Crown agree that a lasting treaty must be sealed not only in ink, but in bond. The Orc emissary's brow lowered. "Speak plainly." The diplomat inclined his head. General Vera Bloodtide's life was preserved by Kalen of the Royal Medici Corps. An act of mercy in a moment of slaughter. That act has become symbol. Vera's jaw tightened. The diplomat continued, voice unwavering. "To bind this treaty in undeniable proof of unity, it is proposed that General Vera and Kalen enter into union. Marriage, a living covenant between our peoples." The word detonated in the still air. Even the wind seemed to halt. Vera stared as though she had misheard. "You reduce me to ornament?" she demanded, voice low and lethal. "A banner to be paraded between armies?" The Orc emissary did not look surprised. Angry, but not surprised. "This was discussed," the emissary said carefully. "Your survival presents opportunity." Opportunity. Her amber eyes blazed. "To chain me to a human?" The human diplomat raised a hand. "Not chain. Unite." Vera laughed once, sharp and humorless. "You insult both our races." Kalen felt heat rise in his chest. "With respect," he said, stepping forward despite himself. "No one asked me either." All eyes turned to him. "You would have a choice," the diplomat replied evenly. Kalen almost smiled at that. "Almost. If I refuse." The diplomat did not hesitate. "The war resumes. And next time, mercy may not intervene." The truth of it hung heavy. Pride could restart slaughter in a heartbeat. Vera studied Kalen now, not as healer, not as enemy, but as potential fate. "You would bind yourself to the one responsible for your soldiers' deaths?" she asked quietly. "You would bind yourself to the one who spared yours," he returned. For a moment, neither blinked. The Orc emissary leaned forward. "This union would grant ceasefire across all contested territories. Shared trade routes. Recognition of borders. Any violation would break not just treaty, but marriage oath. It creates mutual vulnerability. And mutual leverage," Vera muttered. "Yes," the diplomat admitted. "Which ensures neither side moves lightly." Silence again. But this silence was heavier, thick with calculation rather than outrage. Vera's mind moved as swiftly as it did in battle. She saw the numbers, the dying clans, the weakening lines. She saw young warriors training for wars that would leave nothing but graves. And she saw the alternative, continuation of endless bloodshed. She exhaled slowly. "If I agree," she said at last, voice measured steel, "it is not submission. It is strategy." "Of course," the emissary replied. Her gaze shifted to Kalen. "And you, healer? Will you become symbol?" He had never wanted to be anything more than hands that stopped bleeding. But he had seen too many bodies. Too many boys no older than children. "If it ends this," he said quietly, "I will." There was no romance in the words. No softness. Only weary resolve. The diplomat straightened. "Then it is settled." Outside the pavilion, murmurs rippled through both camps as the announcement was carried outward. Shock, anger, confusion, hope. The reactions fractured along invisible lines. Vera turned toward the valley where yesterday's battle had raged. "You understand," she said without looking at Kalen, "that this does not make us allies." "No," he replied calmly. "It makes us necessary." For the first time, something unreadable crossed her expression. Not anger, not approval. Recognition, perhaps. The treaty would be drafted by sunset. The wedding would follow within 3 days. And as both armies returned to their camps carrying news stranger than victory or defeat, One truth settled across the battlefield. Peace would not be forged with swords. It would be forged with two people who had every reason to hate each other and chose not to let the war decide for them. The announcement did not calm the camps, it ignited them. By nightfall, both sides buzzed with disbelief sharp enough to cut. Human soldiers muttered in clusters around cook fires, questioning the sanity of binding one of their own to the butcher of Eastfall. Orc warriors sharpened blades with harder strokes than necessary, calling the proposal humiliation disguised as honor. War had been simple. War had clear lines. Marriage blurred them. Vera stood alone at the edge of the Orc encampment, overlooking the valley where smoke still curled faintly from yesterday's devastation. The Iron Legion kept their distance, not out of disrespect, but because their general's silence carried weight. When she was this still, something vast was moving beneath the surface. "You could refuse," came a deep voice behind her. Chakra Warbraid, matriarch of the Steel Council, stepped into view. Older, scarred, eyes bright with intelligence sharpened by decades of command. "I could," Vera replied. And the war resumes." Her voice did not waver. "And the young die so that pride may remain intact." Chakra's lips twitched faintly. "You speak like a chieftain, not a general. I am tired of counting the dead." Chakra nodded slowly. "Then understand this clearly. If you accept, you are not bending knee to humans. You are forcing them to carry our future alongside you. They will hate it. So will we. That is how you know it matters." Vera turned her gaze back to the valley. Somewhere beyond those ridges, Kalen sat in the human camp, likely enduring his own storm of judgment. "I do not do this for affection," she said flatly. "Good," Chakra answered. "Affection fades. Obligation endures." Across the field, in the human command quarters, Kalen faced less measured counsel. "You're making a mistake," snapped Captain Arden, an old comrade whose face still bore scars from battles Vera had commanded. "You've seen what she's done." "I have," Kalen replied quietly. "And you'll lie beside her? Share roof and table with someone who's ordered men into slaughter?" Kalen's jaw tightened, but he did not rise to anger. "I've stitched up boys who killed her soldiers. I've cleaned blood from hands that weren't clean. If I measure worth by who has caused death, none of us deserve peace." Arden stared at him as if seeing someone unfamiliar. "You're not a politician." "No," Kalen agreed. "I'm tired." That single word held more truth than any speech. Tired of loss. Tired of patching wounds that reopened each season. Tired of knowing that mercy had become rarer than victory. Later that night, a messenger summoned him to the neutral pavilion once more. Vera was already there, armor replaced by dark ceremonial attire that bore clan markings in silver thread. No weapons at her sides. No helm to hide her expression. The guards withdrew, leaving them alone beneath lantern light. "This is not how I imagined ending this war," she said first. "I don't think anyone did." Her amber eyes searched his face, looking perhaps for weakness or arrogance. She found neither. "Understand something clearly," she continued. "I do not need saving. I know. I do not need protecting. I know." A flicker of something passed between them, not agreement, not conflict. Recognition. "This marriage," she said, "is duty. Nothing more." Kalen nodded. "Duty is enough." She studied him a moment longer. "You do not hate me." It was not accusation. It was curiosity. "I hated you," he admitted, "before I met you. And now I know you bleed." Silence stretched, heavy but not hostile. Outside, two armies waited for signs of weakness. Vera extended her hand, not in tenderness, but in pact. "If we do this," she said, "we do it with strength. No hesitation. No apology." Kalen took her hand firmly. No regret. The handshake was not romantic. It was strategic. Two warriors agreeing to stand where arrows would fly thickest. Beyond the pavilion walls, resentment simmered. There would be opposition. Sabotage. Perhaps assassination attempts from those who believed peace was betrayal. But inside that quiet lantern-lit space, something subtle shifted. Not affection. Not trust. Resolve. 3 days remained until the ceremony. 3 days until two enemies would become something the world had never seen before. And whether they liked it or not, the future of two nations now rested not on swords, but on their willingness to endure each other without letting hate decide the outcome. The morning of the ceremony dawned beneath a sky the color of forged steel, cold, bright, and mercilessly clear. The valley that had once echoed with screams and clashing iron had been transformed overnight into a neutral ceremonial ground. Banners of the human crown stood opposite the war standards of the Iron Legion, their colors snapping sharply in the wind. Soldiers from both sides lined the perimeter in rigid formation, weapons sheathed, but not far from reach. No one trusted this peace yet. Peace had not earned that right. At the center of the valley, a raised platform of unfinished oak had been built, plain, deliberate, unadorned by excessive ornament. A symbolic choice. This was not a celebration. It was a statement. Kalen stood at one side of the platform in formal military attire, metals polished, though he had never cared for them. They felt heavier than armor. Across from him, Vera emerged between two orc standard-bearers, clad in ceremonial battle armor, not ornate, but etched with clan sigils that told stories of lineage and victory. Her long dark braids were woven tight against her scalp, silver rings threaded through them that caught the morning light. She looked every inch a general, not a bride. When their eyes met across the platform, there was no smile, no softness, only acknowledgement. This was not romance. This was treaty. King Brennan himself presided for the human side, flanked by high-ranking nobles whose faces betrayed a mix of skepticism and discomfort. Opposite them stood Chakra Warbraid and the Steel Council elders, their expressions carved from stone. The officiant, Brother Simeon, a cleric whose trembling hands had once tended battlefield graves, stepped forward. His voice carried thin but steady across the silent field. "Today," he began, "we bind not two hearts, but two peoples, not to erase the past, but to choose a future beyond it." A murmur rippled through the assembled ranks, quickly silenced by commanding glares. Vera stepped forward first. Orc tradition demanded the warrior enter battle or covenant without hesitation. She removed the gauntlet from her right hand and extended it palm up, a visible sign that she carried no hidden blade. Kalen followed suit, removing his own glove. His hand bore scars from years of stitching flesh under fire. They stood facing one another at arm's length. "You enter this union not as surrender," Chakra declared, voice ringing like a war drum, "but as oath. And not as conquest," King Brennan added firmly, "but as covenant." Brother Simeon lifted two rings, simple bands forged from iron smelted jointly from human and orc mines. Imperfect metal, visibly blended. Kalen spoke first. "I vow to stand beside you," he said clearly, voice steady despite the weight of thousands of watching eyes. "Not as master or rival, but as partner. I vow to uphold peace, even when peace is harder than war." Vera's gaze did not waver. "I vow to fight no more battles against your people without just cause," she said, her voice carrying with commanding resonance. "I vow to hold this treaty as I would my blade, without weakness." It was not a gentle vow. It was not tender, but it was honest. Kalen slid the iron band onto her finger. The metal looked stark against green skin marked by scars. Vera did the same for him, her grip firm enough to remind him of her strength without crushing bone. Brother Simeon raised his hands. "By oath spoken and witness gathered, this union stands. Let no sword break what necessity has forged." There was no cheer, no applause, only a long exhale from thousands of lungs that had prepared themselves for something to go wrong. But nothing did. Vera stepped to Kalen's side as tradition required. Not behind him, not in front, beside. For a long moment, neither moved. Then King Brennan raised his hand high, signaling the formal lowering of arms. One by one, human soldiers dropped their clenched fists from sword pommels. Across the field, orc warriors grounded the hafts of their axes. A symbolic act. Fragile, reversible, but real. As the crowd began to disperse under strict watch, Vera leaned slightly toward Kalen without turning her head. "This changes nothing between us," she said quietly. "It changes everything," he replied. Her lips almost curved, but did not. "Do not mistake survival for trust." "I won't." They descended from the platform together, walking between ranks of soldiers who watched them with varying degrees of resentment, curiosity, and reluctant awe. Behind them, the battlefield remained scarred. Ahead of them, the path would not be easier. Peace, they both understood, would not be sealed by vows alone. It would be tested, again and again. But on that cold, steel-colored morning, Beneath banners that once faced each other in hatred, two enemies had chosen to stand together instead of opposite. And for the first time in 3 generations, the valley heard silence where war drums had once thundered. The palace assigned to them was not neutral ground, it only pretended to be. Though banners from both kingdoms hung side by side in its grand hall, the stone itself had been laid by human hands centuries ago. The corridors echoed differently for Vera, too smooth, too polished, too deliberate. Orc fortresses were carved from mountain and necessity, their walls rough and honest. Here, everything gleamed with careful deception. Vera noticed the stairs first. Servants who hesitated before approaching her. Guards who shifted uneasily when she passed. Nobles who bowed stiffly to Kaelin but avoided her gaze entirely. She met every look without lowering her chin. If they would not respect her, they would at least learn to fear underestimating her. Kaelin noticed something else, how alone she was. Their assigned chambers were vast, unnecessarily so. A single shared bed dominated the room, framed in carved oak and draped in linen that probably cost more than an entire soldier's yearly pay. Vera stood at the threshold the first evening, surveying it as though it were a battlefield trap. "This is excessive," she said flatly. "Royal standards," Kaelin replied, setting aside the diplomatic documents he had been handed earlier. "We're meant to look united. Are we?" He met her eyes across the room. "We're meant to appear so." She gave a quiet huff at that and crossed to the far side of the chamber, placing her armor carefully on a stand. Even unarmed, she carried herself like a warrior on guard. The first nights were silent wars of proximity. They shared space without touching it, shared air without breathing it the same way. When Vera prayed quietly in Orcish before dawn, low chants to ancestors whose bones lay scattered across contested fields, Kaelin did not interrupt. When Kaelin woke from nightmares and cold sweats, the faint scent of smoke and iron clinging to his memory, Vera pretended not to notice the tremor in his breathing. Until one night, she did not. He had woken sharply, breath ragged, fingers digging into the mattress as though bracing for impact. Without thinking, Vera's hand moved, not gently, but firmly, to his shoulder. "You are not there," she said. He blinked at her in the dark. For a moment, neither general nor medic, just two people haunted by the same valley. "Sometimes I still hear it," he admitted quietly. "So do I." The honesty lingered longer than either expected. Days passed in diplomatic routines, joint appearances, public meals, strategic councils. The court observed them constantly, searching for cracks in the facade. One afternoon, during a state dinner meant to demonstrate unity, a human noble deliberately ignored Vera's presence, addressing every question to Kaelin as if she were invisible. Vera endured it in silence until the noble made a dismissive remark about orc temperaments. The room tensed. Before she could respond, Kaelin set his goblet down with quiet finality. "General Bloodtide commands armies larger than your estate," he said evenly. "If you wish to discuss temperament, I suggest you do so respectfully." The noble flushed. The room fell silent. Vera did not thank him later. Orc pride did not operate in such currency. But that night, she moved her armor stand slightly closer to the center of the chamber. Small shifts, small acknowledgments. They began to speak more in private, not about war, but about culture. She explained clan rights, the significance of scars, why orcs considered leaving stone unfinished a sign of truth rather than negligence. He explained human burial traditions, the meaning behind their cathedral carvings, the reason humans wrote so many records, because forgetting terrified them more than death. "You catalog everything," she observed once. "We lose too much," he replied. "We're afraid if we don't write it down, it never existed." She considered that carefully. Orcs remember through story, through repetition, through scars. "Maybe that's why you're harder to break," he murmured. She didn't answer, but she didn't disagree. Trust did not bloom. It grew like stone under pressure, slow, reluctant, shaped by force. They trained together eventually, under the pretense of public demonstration. What began as political theater became something else. Kaelin learned the rhythm of her strikes. Vera learned the patience of his footwork. Their movements stopped colliding and began aligning. Watching soldiers whispered, not in suspicion now, but in curiosity. One evening, as dusk painted the palace walls in fading gold, Vera stood beside him at the balcony overlooking the capital city. Human and orc merchants now shared the outer market district, cautious, tense, but present. They still look at us like spectacle, she said. They'll stop, Kalen replied. When, when we stop acting like enemies sharing space. She studied him sidelong. And what are we now? He thought about it. About blood in the valley. About vows spoken beneath banners. About nights of shared silence. We're learning, he said finally. Vera exhaled slowly, watching the city lights flicker alive below. For warriors, she said, learning is the hardest discipline. Yes, he agreed. But neither stepped away. And for the first time since the wedding of blades and banners, the distance between them felt less like obligation and more like choice. Peace did not unravel all at once. It frayed. The first sign was small, graffiti carved into the outer palace wall beneath cover of night. Traitor King. Beast Bride. The guards scrubbed it before dawn, but the message lingered in whispers. Human nobles who had bowed stiffly at the wedding began declining invitations to shared councils. Orc envoys reported unrest among border clans who believed Vera had traded strength for softness. The treaty held, but it trembled. The assassination attempt came during what was supposed to be a harmless display of unity. A trade summit had been arranged in the central courtyard, human merchants presenting crafted goods beside orc smiths unveiling joint-forged weapons, steel layered with iron from both territories. Kalen stood beside Vera as dignitaries observed the demonstration, guards forming a loose but visible perimeter. It felt controlled, predictable. Then the crossbow bolt split the air. It struck the stone column inches from Vera's head. Kalen didn't think. He moved. He pulled her down as a second bolt sliced through the space she'd occupied. The courtyard erupted in chaos, guards shouting, steel drawn, civilians scattering. Orc warriors surged forward instinctively. Human soldiers mirrored the motion, and for a heartbeat it looked like the fragile peace would shatter in mutual panic. Stand down, Vera roared, her voice cutting through the frenzy like a war horn. Kalen was already on his feet, scanning rooftops. He spotted the glint of another bolt just before it fired. He shoved Vera aside. Drawing the short blade, he carried more out of habit than confidence. The bolt grazed his shoulder, tearing cloth, but not flesh. Orc guard Nazarick leapt from the courtyard steps with terrifying precision, scaling a nearby stairwell two at a time. Human archers followed, arrows trained on the rooftops. Within moments, a cloaked figure was dragged down from a parapet, human. The courtyard fell silent except for ragged breathing. The assassin struggled violently as guards forced him to his knees. His face was twisted with hatred sharp enough to taste. You shame us, he spat toward Kalen. You lie with monsters while our sons rot in graves. Vera stepped forward, eyes burning, but not with blind fury. With control. Your sons died in war, she said evenly. And more would die if we failed. You think breeding with them will save us? He snarled. Kalen stepped in front of her then, not because she needed protection, but because he chose to stand there. Peace doesn't erase loss, he said quietly. It prevents more of it. The assassin laughed bitterly. You've made enemies of both sides. Perhaps he was right. Reports came swiftly after interrogation. The attacker belonged to a human faction calling themselves the Pure Banner. Extremists who believed any alliance with orcs was corruption. But intelligence from orc territories brought similar news. A splinter clan called the Red Maw had begun openly condemning Vera's union, claiming she had dishonored warrior blood. Extremism had found common ground. That night, security doubled. The palace gates closed earlier than usual. The city hummed with unease. Vera stood in their chamber, removing her gauntlets with sharp efficiency. They will not stop, she said. No, Kalen agreed. They won't. Your people blame you. Some do. Mine blame me. I know. She studied him in silence. You saved me again. You would have done the same. Yes, she admitted. I would have. The weight of that settled between them. This was no longer ceremony. This was shared danger. They want us divided, Kalen said. If either of us falls, the treaty fractures. Then we do not fall, she replied simply. Later that evening, they stood before a joint council. Human nobles and orc chieftains gathered under tense scrutiny. Rumors of the attack had already spread. Fear feeds quickly. Vera addressed them first. An arrow does not break a shield, she declared. It tests it. Kalen followed. Those who fear peace will try to fracture it. But if we retreat now, Every death before this treaty becomes meaningless. Murmurs filled the chamber. Doubt, reflection, resistance. Then Chakra Warbraid rose slowly from her seat among the Orc delegation. The Steel Council stands with General Bloodtide, she announced. After a pause long enough to feel dangerous, King Brennan stood as well. And the crown stands with Captain Kalen. It was not thunderous applause, but it was commitment. When the council dispersed, the message had shifted. The assassination attempt had not fractured the alliance. It had clarified it. Extremists existed on both sides. And for the first time, both kingdoms understood that protecting peace required as much vigilance as waging war. That night, as the palace quieted, Vera stood beside Kalen at the balcony once more. "They will come again," she said. "Yes." She glanced at him, amber eyes steady. "We fight together." He nodded. Together. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, unseen enemies sharpened their blades, not against two nations, but against two people who had become harder to divide than either side expected. Peace had drawn blood, but it had not broken. The second attempt did not come with warning or spectacle. It came with silence. 3 weeks after the courtyard attack, Kalen and Vera were scheduled to travel to the border city of Durnhold, a contested trade hub where the first permanent joint market would open under treaty protection. The symbolism was deliberate. Where once siege towers had stood, merchant stalls would rise. Where arrows had flown, contracts would be signed. The convoy moved at dawn, human cavalry riding alongside Orc outriders, a formation still strange enough to draw stares from villagers along the road. Kalen rode slightly behind Vera, not out of hierarchy, but awareness. They had stopped pretending distance meant safety. Halfway through the mountain pass, the ambush sprang. No shouted war cry, no visible banners. The first explosion of dust came from beneath the lead wagon. Hidden charges triggered to collapse part of the narrow cliffside path. Horses screamed. Soldiers scattered. Rocks rained down. Shield left. Vera barked instantly, wheeling her mount with commanding precision. Arrows followed, human fletching and orc-crafted shafts alike. Coordinated. Unified. Extremists, Kalen muttered grimly. Cowards, Vera corrected. They dismounted almost simultaneously. There was no need for instruction. They moved on instinct now, not as two armies forced together, but as two warriors who understood each other's rhythm. An attacker lunged from the tree line toward Vera's blind side. Kalen intercepted with a defensive strike, blade catching the man's weapon just long enough for Vera's counterattack to disarm him with brutal efficiency. "You're slow," she snapped. "You're reckless," he shot back. It was almost familiar, almost comfortable. Another figure charged from behind, a Redmaw warrior by his markings. Before he could strike, a human guard tackled him from the side. Trust, once fragile, now held in motion. The fighting lasted less than 10 minutes. When it ended, several attackers lay wounded but alive. They had not come to win a battle. They had come to kill a symbol. As soldiers secured the prisoners, Kalen wiped blood, not his own, from his sleeve. Vera stood beside him, chest rising steadily, eyes scanning for lingering threat. "They work together," she observed. "Yes. Hatred makes strange alliances. So does fear." The prisoners were bound and questioned swiftly. Under interrogation, the truth surfaced. Members of the Pure Banner and Redmaw factions had coordinated the strike. Their reasoning was simple. If the marriage ended in blood, war would resume. Order would return. The old world would reassert itself. They believed chaos was preferable to change. That night, camped beneath uneasy stars, Vera sat apart from the others. Kalen approached quietly, lowering himself beside her near the fire. "You could still leave," she said without looking at him. He studied the flames. "Could you?" "No." "Then neither can I." She turned to face him fully now. "You understand what this means," she said. "They will never stop. We will always be targets." "Yes. You did not ask for this. I chose it." Silence again. But this time it was not tense. It was reflective. "You saved me in a valley of corpses," she said slowly. "At first, I thought it weakness. Then I thought it strategy. Now," she paused, searching for the word. "Now," he prompted. "Now I think it was courage." He let out a soft breath. Courage would have been easier if it came with certainty. It never does. A distant guard call echoed across the camp perimeter. Vera looked back at him, something unguarded in her expression. No longer obligation. no longer calculation. If we survive this, she said quietly, it will not be because of Treaty Inc. No, it will be because we stand together by choice. Kalen reached for her hand, not ceremonially, not politically, simply because he wanted to. I'm not here because the king ordered it, he said. I'm here because I don't want to fight you, or without you. Her grip tightened around his fingers, strong, grounding. In Orcish, she said, there is a word. Korvath. It means shared fate, not bound by law, bound by decision. He nodded. Then that's what we are. Above them, the night stretched vast and uncertain. Behind them lay generations of blood. Ahead of them waited more resistance, more fear, more tests of resolve. But something fundamental had shifted. This was no longer survival out of duty. It was partnership chosen despite consequence. When dawn came, they rode into Durnhold side by side. The damaged pass behind them had already become story. How human and orc soldiers defended each other instead of turning blades inward. Whispers followed them through the marketplace, but they sounded different now. Not merely suspicion, possibility. Peace was no longer abstract. It had bled. It had endured. It had fought back. And at its center stood two people who had every reason to remain enemies, yet had chosen something far harder. Each other. The first true test of the treaty did not come from assassins or extremists. It came from hunger. 3 months after the ambush in the mountain pass, a drought struck the southern borderlands. Human farmland that had long depended on trade routes once controlled by orc clans. Crops withered. Wells ran low. Whispers rose again, sharper this time. They would let us starve, some humans muttered about their new allies. Across the mountains, the Iron Legion faced its own strain. The Red Maw faction, though weakened, had retreated into isolated strongholds and begun hoarding grain shipments meant for joint markets. They framed it as strength, as reclaiming pride. War, once a roar, was now a whisper waiting for wind. Vera stood in the war council chamber of the Steel Council, armor polished but expression severe. Clan leaders argued across the long stone table. If humans suffer, they will blame us regardless, one chieftain growled. Why weaken ourselves further? Because weakness lies in fear, Vera answered sharply. If they starve while we sit on surplus, the treaty dies. And when it dies, the war resumes. And perhaps war is cleaner than this humiliation, another muttered. Vera's eyes hardened. War is not clean. It is wrought disguised as glory. The room fell quiet. Meanwhile, in the human capital, Kalen stood before King Brennan and a council of nobles whose patience was thinning. Our people are hungry, one noble snapped. And we are told the orcs have grain reserves. They do, Kalen confirmed. And yet we wait? They are divided, he replied. Extremists have seized supply routes. Then we mobilize. And undo every step we've taken? Kalen countered calmly. If we march now, we prove the extremists correct. That peace was weakness. The king studied him closely. What do you propose? Kalen did not hesitate. A joint expedition. Human and orc forces together. Not to fight each other, but to reclaim the stolen grain from Red Maw territory. Silence rippled across the chamber. You would ask our soldiers to fight beside theirs? A noble asked incredulously. I would ask them to fight for the same thing, Kalen replied. Food. Stability. Survival. By nightfall, the message was sent across borders. By dawn, Vera was riding beside Kalen once more, this time not toward neutral ground, not toward ceremony, but toward battle fought shoulder to shoulder. The campaign against the Red Maw stronghold was swift and decisive. Human engineers breached barricades while orc warriors held flanking lines. Signals were exchanged not through shouted mistrust, but coordinated strategy. Extremists fell not to overwhelming force, but to unified resolve. When the grain stores were reclaimed, it was Vera who ordered half immediately sent south to the drought-stricken human provinces. When the shipments arrived under Steel Legion escort, the reaction was stunned silence. No banners burned. No betrayal. Just food. Weeks later, in the valley where the war had once raged and the wedding had been held, a different gathering took place. Joint caravans moved freely between territories now. Merchants haggled in mixed dialects. Human children watched orc smiths hammer steel with fascinated awe. Orc youths studied human maps and scripts. It was not perfect. There were still stares, still skeptics, still scars. But there was also trade. cooperation, shared interest. Vera and Kalen stood together at the edge of the marketplace, observing the movement of life where death had once ruled. You realize, Vera said quietly, we are no longer symbols. He glanced at her. What are we? Proof. He smiled faintly. That's heavier. Yes, she agreed. But stronger. She reached for his hand, not as pact, not as necessity, but because it felt natural. I once believed strength meant domination, she admitted. Victory through force. And now I believe strength is endurance. Choosing restraint when violence is easier. He nodded. My father used to say mercy doesn't make you weak. She met his eyes. It makes you human. And Orc, he added softly. A breeze moved through the valley, carrying the scent of fresh timber and forged smoke, not battlefield ash. Behind them, banners no longer faced each other in opposition. They hung parallel, side by side. Peace had not arrived with fireworks or triumphant songs. It had arrived through drought, ambush, compromise, and the stubborn refusal of two former enemies to let hatred dictate their fate. They had not erased the past. They had built beyond it. As evening settled over the valley, children from both peoples ran through the marketplace without fear of uniform or tusk or scar. Vera watched them with a stillness that held neither regret nor doubt. We did not win a war, she said at last. No, Kalen agreed. We ended one. And in that quiet valley, once soaked in blood, now alive with trade and laughter, their union no longer felt like treaty obligation. It felt like foundation. Peace, forged not in fire alone, but in choice.